This presentation will be on Ernst Cassirer and most especially his conception of the mythologische Lebensform, or the mythical form of life. So it's a primary pleasure to be here talking about this subject. Its importance seems to me to be globalizable, in that we could superimpose it over any analysis of forms of thought or accounts of how the human being is to understand its object, as it were. So we're dealing with the type of thinking which is part of the what Heidegger is understood as ontotheology, but which is to say that we're dealing with the type of thinking that says that everything available or present, all things can be brought under some type of principle. So for instance, one thinks in terms of a move from muthos to logos when one thinks in the way Platon himself thought, because we see Socrates putting forward muthoi, or myths, self-consciously, as the myth of error in the Polity, or the Republic. Which appears near the end, and therefore we could say this indicates that it's not considered to be the most important issue. The issue of the taming of Dike is much more interesting and much more towards the center of the book. So Cassirer understands myth as a form of the human being in some way making a kind of ontotheology, in some way making available the world to ourselves. And so one sees that in myth, for instance, the goddess associated with Dike or Dikeosine, which is we translate justice in our so-called, in the phrase criminal justice system, for instance. That's this goddess Dike, and so the mythological version obviously differs from the Logos version. The Muthos version differs from the Logos version in that we have an epiphany, as it were, of the law in the form of this goddess Dike. It so happens that the word is the same word as the word dike, it's pronounced differently when you transliterate it that way. Of course, it wasn't originally written in this Latin script as we write it. I mean, that I just mentioned, by the way. So this Cassirer sees rites, rites, as a core part of mythos, but there's a distinction to be made between muthos, meaning a certain kind of speech. The original meaning of the word Slav, by the way, that you have a lot of pretenders to understand etymology who derive the word out of the usage in slave camps in the Italian Renaissance era or earlier, which since the Slavs, who are by their own language the people of the word, that's basically what Slav means, people of the word, or people that maybe meaning people that you could actually talk to, rather than animals, or foreign, or I guess, or I mean, we're talking about it at a very primitive time, so I think. But the word Slav, which originally had this sort of significance of saying these are the people that either of the word meaning who you could talk to, or possibly of the word meaning who are proclaiming something sort of like something glorious, as it were, like the word dox is used in the connection to the Bible. Proclaiming, the proclaimers. The muthos is something spoken. It's part of this word. It's something key to a people which is perhaps closer to a tribal people, if we have no better way of designating it. And then you see a presentation which, the way Cassira presents it, he doesn't specifically say, it's sort of like whether we're to be understood as founded on muthos still, as it were, like modern science founded on muthos still, or whether the form of sort of like something like ontotheology, he doesn't use that phrase, but something like that, something like clarifying everything through some form of word in rites or enactments. But I just throw in to be distinguished from this probably Roman phenomenon, which is called religio, and which, according to Grok, it's originary to the Latini in their early phases, and it did have to do with cult worship and the scrupulousness of the priests or hierophants. But according to Cicero, it originated with the scribes and the scrupulosity of people copying official documents. According to the Catholics, religio has to do with some kind of piety. But so in this sense, when Cassira studies myth, he doesn't study religion. But nonetheless, it's sort of like, because the words it's not that easy to neatly disambiguate them, because they're sort of just in power. This is arete, used to be translated as virtue, but then something happened with the Victorians to the word virtue, and we sort of can't contact the old meaning anymore. So some people try to translate it as excellence, or even as I don't know, so somehow like as something that only a maestro could do. But I think the original meaning was simply a sort of competence according to a certain task, which had probably been, according to Cicero, is fortitudio, which was the key virtue of a fighting man, fortitude. But yeah, arete, it probably had some predominant meaning, and probably it did have to do with maybe Andrea, or the courage which is associated with the brutes, like a lion. But it also had to do, certainly later on, especially with athletics. But of course, the common usage was different than the learned usage, just as just as with many words, but also sort of in a certain way, the most common usage of the word virtue sounds more like it has to do with the chastity of Victorian women, somehow to the native ear, than it does sounds like it has to do with the ancient Greeks and with the martial culture. I mean, you have to remember that if we're talking about 4th century BC Athens, even though they praised the Spartans as though the Spartans were much more serious about war, they still weren't. Everybody involved in the dialogues were people that were either had already been at war or were fully expecting to take part in war and training accordingly in the gymnasium and so on. The clamor of this crescendo passage. All right. So I think it's interesting to try to enter into Cassir's larger idea. First, we're talking about thinking. So Cassir's saying that muthos is a form of thinking. Thinking means trying to say what the thing is. But when you try to say what the thing is, then that means that you give a particular single thing-like character to the trait you depict the whole world in, or the cosmos. The cosmos gets thematized. So let's look at it from, or let's wait for this clamor to subside a little bit. It'll probably start up again, but all right. We have Cassir casting myth as a type of thought, so just in the same tradition as Heidegger's giving his Was heißt denken lecture, what is thinking? So it's a very large sense. And in muthos, we don't yet have this type of theory like we're so used to of transcendental subjectivity, of post-Descartes questions. Muthos, we have this type of thing like there's Zeus and some gods who've overthrown the Titans, and they're somehow nonetheless not more powerful than the Fates, something like that. And then there's this question of like, how powerful is decay here? How powerful is justice? This type, something like that. So you see in myths already a kind of orientation taking, a thinking, sizing up of the cosmos, sort of a spatializing. And then so it's like, I think it's interesting here. So there's this famous ledger from 1939, October of 1939, from Leo Strauss to Jakob Klein, on the question, does Homer think? So Strauss isn't particularly worried about this textual questions of how the development of the Iliad as in the Peri-Lord theory and so on, whether there's one Homer, whether the rhapsodes themselves had been totally the piecemeal inventors of Homer and so on. But what he's really concerned is like whether the contents of the text reveal something like in Hesiod, where there's the form of mythology, but one can, as it were, prove to oneself, so that a serious person can take to say, this is what should be taught. This is how we should understand it, because we could basically prove to ourselves that Hesiod was not sort of singing a myth. He wasn't part of a cult rite in the older sense, but he was propounding a logos. He had a teaching that he was trying to put forward, but the language he had available to him was the language of the that had come down to him, the muthos. But what Strauss says with his "Does Homer think?" is Homer. So, for instance, with and Homer is actually the origin of the word physis or nature, on this notion of this Molly branch, which is in America, Molly is slang, I think, mostly for marijuana or cannabis, but maybe it's also for other drugs. But it's in the Odyssey, Athena tells Odysseus to use this to counteract the magic of Circe, who's like turning Odysseus's fellows into animals. And then he draws a sword on, and since he's used this plant to protect himself, then he's able to draw his sword to the neck of Circe and force her to compel her to release his compatriots from the spell. And yeah, this phusis as applied to that root seems to imply that the author Homer is giving us a kind of teaching about how to understand things. Like phusis means it has a certain look and that it has a certain potential or dunamis. So it's almost like the this that, which is more developed, of course, by Aristotle, tutti, eini, and so on. This what it is as against that it is. Is already in a vague way propounded by Homer. I use Homer, of course, like again in scare quotes or whatever. I mean, personally, I think there's original Homer, and then rhapsodes for 1,000 years or more were making here and there alterations. And I think Iliad and Odyssey are both by the same author. But that's just my view. I don't make any attempt to convince anyone of it, especially. Although I'm convinced of it myself. But in any case, what Strauss is saying is we have lots of evidence that Homer thinks. But it's obvious that he saw things, or does logos, but it's not obvious that Homer thinks. Sometimes you look at it and you just think one of the rhapsodes heard something that sounded interesting and they included it or whatever. You don't really quite know. Another example that Strauss gives that's very famous is the shield of Achilles. The shield of Achilles is very famous because I think they have a special word for ekphrasius or something like that, fully speaking out the description of something. And it's supposed to be a very early example in literature of an extended description of something like a picture. So there's like a picture on the shield, but it's not a Medusa's head as one might think, but it's rather this sort of the moon and the stars and the sun, the sort of the cosmos, and then it's sort of like two cities, or one city is like operating well and has a court of justice, and the other city is like burning up, like Kiev, and other things which are then surrounded in by ocean. So it's like on a flat, and this is like a diorama almost of in like sunken relief on the bronze shield of the Greek vision of the world, of the cosmos. But see, of the world, actually, not of the cosmos. The cosmos is more like the stars and the sun and the moon and the picture of the physics, but that's happening actually on this island floating in the disk. This is a Michael Morley experiment floated in some kind of mercury, so they could turn it around. But in this case, the world island floating in the sort of on the disk of the shield of Achilles, but surrounded by the ocean river. So we have apparently, in a way, a thinking coming through in this image, which is a kind of teaching. I mean, that's a possible way to think about it. Or it's, in another way, it's just a rising of sort of familiarity with this image. Because you get familiar with things, you get used to thinking about them that way. So I think, there's a nice fructification as possible in the superimposition of Strauss's question connected to Iliad and Cassira's main research on the muthos, or the muthalische Lebensform.